Honourable Elliot Phillips.
And not burdening the public purse with those tickets, Mr. Speaker. So I think that corrects the record insofar as the suggestion, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady was not trying to mislead the House in relation to that point, but that corrects the factual basis for the purchase and our contribution to those tickets, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is my 7th budget and 6th contribution to the debate on the appropriation bill currently before the House, Mr. Speaker. And before I get to the substance of my address, I echo the thanks expressed, Mr. Speaker, by members of this House in relation to your team here at Parliament for the work that they do all year round to support members. Mr. Speaker, of course, the Honourable Gentleman Chief Minister wishes to interrupt me daily on every single subject. We'll let him have his reply, Mr. Speaker, eventually. But what I would say, Mr. Speaker, we thank you all for the support that you've offered members of this House, irrespective of the side that they sit, Mr. Speaker. Our civil servants in this place go about their daily obligations without fear or favour, Mr. Speaker, and they are a credit to the service. In my interactions with your staff, Mr. Speaker, their response time has always been excellent, and I appreciate their guidance, Mr. Speaker. The parliamentary team are placed in a difficult spot, Mr. Speaker, not because of the job, but because the way in which the government conducts itself in managing the parliamentary diary, Mr. Speaker, with very little notice to you or your staff, Mr. Speaker, not to mention the elected members on this side of the House. Whilst it is appreciated, Mr. Speaker, that urgent and emergency-type government business may rarely upset things, the government must make sure that this House works for all members of Parliament so that you can, in turn, Mr. Speaker, provide, and we can provide, a better service to the public. I have not been shy, Mr. Speaker, in saying this in this House, and I've not been shy in saying that this House does not work as it should and is in desperate need of reform. This place, Mr. Speaker, should be a place for informed debate, collaboration for the good of the community, scrutiny, and holding the government to account. The quality of the answers we have received in this House for many years now by the Honourable Gentleman Lady across the floor of this House have little regard, Mr. Speaker, for accuracy, and lead me to the conclusion that this House is an opportunity for the Chief Minister and the government that he leads to grandstand at every single possible occasion and diminish and suppress the role of opposition, Mr. Speaker. We will not be diminished, suppressed or silenced, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to robustly oppose the government so that the alternative can be put before the House and ultimately before the people at the next general election, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Deputy Chief Minister spoke about planned physical changes to improve the functionality and accessibility of this House, and they are welcome, Mr. Speaker. But the elephant in the chamber is not so much the physical changes, but a deeper introspection as to how we improve the quality of the work that we do in this chamber. People hold, Mr. Speaker, this institution in high regard, but there are some fundamental issues which must be tackled so that the quality of our democracy can be enhanced. I am personally disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that the Parliamentary Reform Select Committee has not met, despite it being established many years ago. Mr. Speaker, the last 2 years has been difficult and challenging years for our community. We have had continued uncertainty as to our place in the world post-Brexit, and whilst its negotiators endlessly pick through the detail of the deal, it is important to understand that continued uncertainty is causing us serious anxiety within our community about our future and its relationship with the European Union and indeed others. Coupled with the pandemic, we have had it tough, Mr. Speaker. Our citizens have had their liberties restricted, and over 104 of our men and women have lost their lives to COVID, whilst many thousands of people have had their physical and mental health impacted from being locked down, Mr. Speaker. Our people needed and continue to need our support during this period. We as a community did what we did to protect the GHA and the lives of many more that arguably would have been lost if we did nothing, Mr. Speaker. Our thoughts and prayers are with those that have lost loved ones, those who are afflicted with long COVID, and our healthcare warriors who continue to attempt to manage a virus that will no doubt live with us long into the future. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I wish the Honourable, the Father of the House, Sir Joe Bossano, a speedy recovery. We should also, Mr. Speaker, spare a thought for the many, many people in our community who have struggled to access basic appointments, treatments and operations during this time, and what many within and outside our GHA are describing as healthcare services on its knees, Mr. Speaker. If COVID has taught us anything, is that life changes at the blink of an eye. And whilst we must be thankful for what we have, we must at all costs protect those that need our support the most. We may not be the largest or most powerful country in the world, but we have each other, Mr. Speaker, and whilst this chamber is a place for heated debate and vocal argument, it has shown that when the chips are down, we are able to unite and defend our way of life, be that a challenge to our status, our economy, or our health security. What the last 2 years has also done, Mr. Speaker, is expose our vulnerability and our weaknesses. The last 2 years has shone a floodlight on areas which are creaking under the pressure of expectation and need. One such area, Mr. Speaker, is the crisis in healthcare, which my colleagues and I have been talking about for some time. As Shadow Minister for Health, I have observed that health security, public health and our GHA have been put under the spotlight in 2 ways. Firstly, in how the GHA came together to respond to the COVID emergency, and 2, how it has been able to emerge from the pandemic in the reset, restart and recovery strategy deployed by the government. Mr. Speaker, governments across the world are learning important lessons from COVID. They are learning from data collected. The state of people's health has a direct correlation as to how they respond to a health crisis. And there is much more that we can do to improve the health of the nation, from improving our collective approach to our own health and well-being. The only way, Mr. Speaker, in my view, in getting down the collective weight of our community is by increasing our activity levels, putting healthy eating at the forefront with exercise. This is the only way that we can bring down the cost of healthcare and the burden that poor choices can have on the public purse in the long term. The world is moving towards a better understanding of the importance of public health, and we need to listen to the experts in this area. I don't believe we do enough in our community to explain the impact that poor dietary choices or a lack of physical activity has on our ability of the GHA to deliver care to the population. Minister Balban's contribution yesterday touched upon improving the nation's health by improving walking and cycling infrastructure. I share his passion, but he appears to be a lone voice on those benches in relation to the commitment to a green and child-friendly city, Mr. Speaker. As for the Minister for Civil Contingencies, she said in her contribution moments ago, it is clear to all that COVID is here to stay. We must learn to live with the risks associated with COVID and ensure that our community is provided with a health service that is fit for purpose, that our healthcare professionals are not demoralised, and our people have confidence in the leadership at the GHA, and that confidence translates into a decent health service being provided to our community. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'm responsible for health and transport and the environment amongst other portfolios, Mr. Speaker. The one portfolio that has eclipsed all others in respect to public complaint and engagement is health, and it is one that will dominate my address to the House in this budget alongside transport and the environment. In order to understand the draft estimates, Mr. Speaker, it's important to reflect on the 30th November 21 statement by the now former Health Minister. That statement was supposed to revolutionise healthcare in Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker. Well before the 30th of November 2021 statement, the opposition regularly raised serious concerns about the government's inability to provide leadership over our health service and the provision of a fully functional health service to service users and patients. We have long raised many concerns about the operation and effectiveness of the GHA on a range of disciplines. And whilst COVID has had an impact, matters have of course become more acute during the GSLP Liberal administration of this service. The present Minister for Health yesterday talked about the world being upside down, but it is easy to blame COVID for the problems in the GHA. As I have been at pains to say, COVID has served to highlight where we are going wrong and the systemic problems that have plagued the GHA for years. It is easy to blame everything on COVID, but the truth is that we know, the healthcare professionals know, the public know, the unions know, and the Minister from his contribution yesterday knows that the GHA is broken, Mr. Speaker, and it has been caused by a decade-long mismanagement of priorities and the wider economy, Mr. Speaker. The moment they publicly acknowledge it, the sooner we can get on and move forward. It is clear from the outpouring of criticism from the public that things must change quickly within the GHA. Mr. Speaker, we too have been very vocal in our complaints about the health service, Mr. Speaker. The lack of dental care for our children, the collapsed PCC appointment system, the telephone line, the face-to-face appointments, cancelled operations, the lack of financial control in relation to procurement, clinical governance, shocking preventable harm and death raised by the former head of clinical governance, the lack of a chief executive, chief financial officer to lead the GHA, the removal of the micromanager minister from St. Bernard's as a signal that things need to change, and the tsunami of poor morale within the service leading to industrial strife. We were critical of the former minister's supervision of the GHA, and under the chief minister's watch, our health service has spiraled downwards from internal crisis to internal crisis with no end in sight. Never, Mr. Speaker, in our history has our health service been in such a state of disarray as under the GSLP Liberal Alliance Administration of Healthcare in Gibraltar. In their time in office, we have seen a massive escalation in the cost of the service. We have seen complaints, litigation, and claims skyrocket. We've experienced systemic waste, and we've heard about shocking, serious concerns about preventable harm and deaths, Mr. Speaker, all on their watch, and they know it. This is nothing to be proud of, Mr. Speaker, and this rests on their shoulders as the guardians of the provision of healthcare. We have heard of normal working families, our elderly, our vulnerable, not being able to access simple appointments, children left without seeing dentists for 3 years, management structure destroyed by years of micromanagement by an incompetent political leadership, and to add salt into the wounds, now a budget which promises mass, uncoordinated and haphazard cuts across the health service, which will inevitably impact on service levels and basic health in our community, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the 30th of November 21 statement, or reconfiguration as described by the former Minister for Health, announced the so-called landmark radical reforms to the GHA in direct response to our comprehensive proposals set out at the last general election, our public statements reflecting the crisis in healthcare. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that once again, where we lead on policy, particularly health policy, the government follow, Mr. Speaker. We on this side of the House welcome the wholesale adoption of GST policy. It was excellent back in 2019, and it is of critical importance now that the GHA have been put under the microscope. Not only by us, Mr. Speaker, but so very vocally by the patients and public at large, Mr. Speaker. Back in 2019, we constructed a package of positive, constructive and radical proposals for the reform of healthcare. We proposed an independent professional management team, as well as structural and qualitative changes to improve the quality of care. In particular, we proposed, one, the introduction of a CEO at the GHA and the appointment of a CFO to monitor procurement and spending of public money in the GHA. We are pleased to note that all of our proposals have been introduced, Mr. Speaker. Where we lead on health, the government follow. Mr. Speaker, the GHA has had 5 ministers. Ministers Cortes, Balban, Costa, Sacramento, and now Minister Isola. Whilst the public watch the ministerial musical chairs at the GHA, our health service stumbles from one crisis to another, without leadership and with public confidence in the service at an all-time low. We now have a new kid on the health block, Mr. Speaker, who happens not to be in the chamber at the time. Minister Isola, let's hope his head is not next on the block. Mr. Speaker, they are running out of front bench ministers to replace him. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman knows that I have a great deal of affection for Mr. Isola and respect him, but I have to say that he should stick to what he is known for and what he appears to be fairly good at, namely financial services and digital assets. The honourable gentleman is a consummate salesman, and he knows how to sell Gibraltar PLC outside Gibraltar, and I personally commend him for his efforts, but I suspect his silver tongue, Mr. Speaker, is not going to come to his aid here with the health service. And whilst I wish him Godspeed and the best of British, I suspect that deep down he knows he's presiding over a health service which is on critical life support. His contribution yesterday, Mr. Speaker, whilst not earth-shattering, it was, though, at the top end of the ad-lib, before he got to his pre-prepared speech, just the usual defensive jabs, none of which landed on his opponents on this side of the House. Mr. Speaker, I suggest he sticks to non-contact sports. Far from it, Mr. Speaker, all he did was to demonstrate that he is able to do the quickest U-turn in political history. It took not less than 24 hours after they announced a ridiculous £25 a week charge affecting all businesses to row back on it, Mr. Speaker. Where in the world does a government, after supposedly thinking properly about their measures, row back on their commitment within 24 hours, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it must be a world record. It's like Limewall Road all over again, Mr. Speaker. More of that later. Mr. Speaker, I do not think that he honestly recognises that Mr. Speaker, I know the Chief Minister is baiting me. He wants to get to his feet, but he's going to have to wait till I finish this. I do not think, Mr. Speaker, he did honestly recognise that all is not well at the GHA, and I got the distinct impression that he may be overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to fix the GHA. There were no answers by him, or indeed the Honourable Lady, who could have answered those questions in relation to the areas which on the surface looked like significant cuts to the healthcare budget, referred to by the Leader of the Opposition in his contribution. I take the absence of a reply as an acceptance that we will have a task on our hands of managing the health budget moving to 2023. They only have themselves to blame, Mr. Speaker, and the public know it. We told them last year that the GHA should be regulated by an independent body and pointed out to them our very carefully designed Care Quality Commission. Our idea, Mr. Speaker. It seems clear that they are giving active consideration to this. We told them to hire a CEO, they hired one. We told them to hire a CFO, they hired one. We told them to move the Minister for Health out of the hospital, and they fired her, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm all for constructive politics, but they haven't got a clue when it comes to managing the healthcare budget. They've simply run out of good ideas, Mr. Speaker, and brought the GHA to its knees. Well, Mr. Speaker, the only thing I will commend them for today is adopting well thought out, prudent, cautious GST policy, Mr. Speaker. Whilst they're at it, I would ask them to introduce an integrated healthcare system, an IT system between primary, secondary and tertiary care, so that the systems can talk to each other, Mr. Speaker. The failure of digital platforms is totally unacceptable, and in 2022 there is no excuse for poor technology in health. The answer to the delivery of better healthcare is to embrace technology, Mr. Speaker, and to ensure a joined-up IT with all aspects of healthcare, so that when you go to visit the doctor or go to the pharmacy, your health record is accessible by health professionals, and you can be provided with the best possible treatment and medication for your ailment. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to healthcare in our community, the cost to the taxpayer for years 2019-2021, namely for 2 years, was a staggering 322 million odd, crudely divided into 161 million each year. The estimate for 2021/2022 was 140 million, Mr. Speaker. The forecast outturn for 2022 is £170 million. In short, Mr. Speaker, we spent 170 million up to March 2022, and the estimate for this time next year is 128 million. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has spent much time attempting to demonstrate the overspend and expertly, Mr. Speaker, in my view, dissected the Chief Minister's contribution and serves to highlight the failure of the government to get a hold on public spending in healthcare. Putting it simply, we spend half of all of our revenue generated from income tax on the health service, Mr. Speaker. The government have committed on numerous occasions to attempt to cut the cost of health. I remember, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Mr. Costa's attempt, but they have been unable to place financial controls and secure efficiencies within the system. And this is why, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Roy Clinton has said that this budget is irresponsible and unrealistic, Mr. Speaker. For every single Minister for Health, the revolving door, as it's well known, has tried and failed to drive efficiencies within the health service. And despite what is set out in the book, it is very difficult to see how they are going to stem the crisis within the GHA. Meanwhile, people continue to suffer and complaints about service rise. The government now and again repeats the efficiencies mantra and now proposes to essentially cut the cost of healthcare from the outturn of 170 to 128 million a year. How are they going to do that, Mr. Speaker? Well, they have no choice. They're going to have to cut services that people rely on, Mr. Speaker. We have already received the pre-budget announcement of a massive hike in prescription costs to the public, Mr. Speaker, and a reduction in those eligible for exemption. We have also learned that now life-saving and life-improving medication to those that need it will be curtailed. I've spoken with many patients and pharmacists alike, and it is clear that patient access to important medicines will now be severely restricted. This is the start of it, Mr. Speaker. What will follow is a period of sustained cuts, and more cuts, Mr. Speaker, to our health services. Mr. Speaker, Appendix F on page 225 of the book provides some insight as to how they will go about butchering our most beloved health service. As we all know, the health service is as good as the people that work in it, and it has always been a place where they have been overwhelmed by the demands placed on them by the service. We have excellent healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker, who are trying their best whilst being completely demoralised, Mr. Speaker. We pay as a community personal emoluments, which include salaries, over £60 million a year. In terms of relief cover, visiting consultants and recruitment expenses, we paid out in 2021-2022 over £15 million. Insofar as those subheads, the government are now budgeting for the years ahead just over £3.4 million, which is a massive cut, Mr. Speaker, which can only direct on the impact and can impact on the delivery of care in our community. Is this seriously realistic, Mr. Speaker? Selecting a number of other areas, you can see that it's not just on people where we're seeing cuts, but on other areas directly affecting patients. When we look at prescriptions, the government intends to cut the costs from 12.5 million to 9 million, a whopping 3.5 million from prescriptions, Mr. Speaker. In terms of medical departments, they intend to reduce the cost from 18 million odd to 5.7. All this to directly impact on healthcare to our community. And Mr. Speaker, we come to the last line of defence in healthcare, our most treasured sponsored patient schemes. Many of our families and members of this House may have been recipients of healthcare delivered elsewhere because we simply cannot provide that quality of care here. I am sad to report to this House, Mr. Speaker, that the government intend to cut sponsored patients from approximately 15 million to 10 million, representing a significant decrease in my view. It is also very disappointing that despite all that is said by them in this House about the importance of support members with disabilities and mental health, that there is no detailed budget for these areas. We will all remember the publication of the Mental Health Situation Alliance report, which was sat on the then Minister for Health's desk for 19 months, Mr. Speaker. That report heavily criticised the government for not having a defined mental health budget. And lo and behold, the report from Public Health England has been ignored once again this year. No mental health budget is properly put forward by them in this year's budget. It is shocking, Mr. Speaker, that in 300 pages there is no mental health budget. They talk about the vulnerable, the weak, and those in need with compassion, but it is never backed up, Mr. Speaker. They're all words, but no action. How many more young men and women have to needlessly suffer in silence because of a lack of provision, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the mental health budget? All this budget does, Mr. Speaker, is demonstrate that they are entirely disconnected from the reality and what is important to this community. Healthcare is our number one priority, and the government have embarked on a culling and mercenary butchery of our healthcare budget, targeting medicine staff and the availability of our well-loved sponsored patient scheme. No amount of spin, Mr. Speaker, that we have heard in the latest in the long line of ministers, or the spin doctor extraordinaire, the Chief Minister himself, will assure the public that what they're doing is embarking on a haphazard scattergun approach to cost-cutting at the expense of patient care. Mr. Speaker, in respect of the purchase of the hospital by the government, we will obviously carefully scrutinise the deal when the details are made available to us. Mr. Speaker, I said in 2018 in this very House that the government had been reckless with the people's money. Mr. Speaker, I said in 2018 it took them 7 years of spend, which saddled our community with debt debt, and debt, Mr. Speaker. We will now have to live with the consequences of his huge appetite, Mr. Speaker, for spending. And that is cuts, cuts, and even more cuts. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister's chickens have certainly come home to roost, and they now seek to blame Brexit and now COVID for their poor planning and mismanagement of the economy. The two characteristics of an economy bruised and battered by a decade of spending cuts, a decade of spending, is cuts to public services and tax increases, and the government have done both. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister almost seems proud of the fact that under his watch he needs to make significant revenue-raising measures, albeit for 2 years, or to lighten the presentation, 24 months, not that that makes a huge amount of difference, of course. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister tells us that this is not a giveaway budget. Mr. Speaker, but what it is a takeaway budget, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Minister is taking away from hard-working families who are enduring a cost of living crisis and higher interest rates, Mr. Speaker. After a decade of spending, we know he now wants to raid our piggy bank, Mr. Speaker, in true Sheriff of Nottingham style, Mr. Speaker. As I have demonstrated, there is less money for medicines needed by patients, less money for sponsored patients, less money for cover, which ultimately has a direct effect on the level of care healthcare provided to our community. How can he be proud of that record? Mr. Speaker, what the Chief Minister cannot get away with in his decade-long of splurging millions at festivals, his Venetian palace, swanky business trips through VVIP World Leader Lounge, and a warlike bunker that can only be rivaled the West Wing, to name a few, all he can point to is a wonderful green park, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable Mr. Eastler spent some time discussing yesterday. We all remember the VVIP tickets issued to all and sundry and his friends. And now, Mr. Speaker, now that he has spent the people's money, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister talks about fairness, a nation of fairness, Mr. Speaker, and the people's toughest budget. There is nothing tough about this budget, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Minister is attempting to position himself as a strong, determined leader who has to take the tough decisions which might not be popular. Well, Mr. Speaker, he wouldn't have had to take those tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, in relation to people's money if he had managed the public purse better over the last decade of his spending, Mr. Speaker. I think it was the Deputy Chief Minister who attempted on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker, to persuade the public that it was a combination of a lethal cocktail of Brexit and COVID that had caused the economic bomb to go off. We do not doubt, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit and COVID has had an impact. But to brush aside the government's addiction to frivolous spending and mismanagement of public finances will not go unnoticed by the public. Whatever the shape of the treaty, Mr. Speaker, it will be too late for the Chief Minister and his cheerleaders. The Chief Minister's conversion to prudence and the age of responsibility is an act, Mr. Speaker, to shield him from a decade of mismanagement and spend. It's a shame, Mr. Speaker, he didn't listen to the perfect storm warning set out by the Honourable Mr. Feetham all those years ago. Mr. Speaker, when the Honourable Gentleman sat down in his chair after describing what he described as the people's budget, our community literally exploded in anger, Mr. Speaker. Social media went into a frenzied criticism of his speech, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the pendulum has truly swung, Mr. Speaker. And this is the champagne-swigging socialists' last budget, Mr. Speaker. They are, Mr. Speaker, bruised and battered, tired and spent with nothing more to give, Mr. Speaker, clinging to the hope that the successes on the treaty will somehow make people forget the domestic nightmare that people have been living with. The community has had enough, Mr. Speaker. They want him gone, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, it is only him and the government that are responsible for the ruinous state of public finances. Mr. Speaker, he talked at length about rebirth and renaissance, Mr. Speaker. Listening to the Chief Minister was like looking at an entirely different human being, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't a rebirth. It wasn't a renaissance. It was a wholesale reincarnation, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Minister is selling himself as Robin Hood, but he is the Sheriff of Nottingham, Mr. Speaker. He is, as my learned friend and my learned and honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, the highwayman, Mr. Speaker. Stand and deliver, I think were the words that he used. Mr. Speaker, we are pleased that he now appears to be counting the pennies, Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Mr. Roy Clinton does on many occasions, Mr. Speaker. But what about those many millions of pounds he spent, Mr. Speaker, on the parties? Is he accountable for that spending spree? I say appears, Mr. Speaker, because even now, when he asks you to dip your hand in your pocket for more tax and electricity and water contributions, he increases his entertainment bill at number 6, commonplace, Mr. Speaker. So in short, where he's gone from drinking Dom Perignon to Prosecco, he still wants you to pay for it, Mr. Speaker. Shame on him, Mr. Speaker. Tell that to the people who can no longer afford medication or obtain the medication they need. Tell that to the people who are living on the breadline, who now have to pay more in tax and utilities. Tell that to sponsored patients who've just had their budgets slashed. Tell that to small businesses, Mr. Speaker, and the unions who have openly and directly criticised this budget, Mr. Speaker. This is not the people's toughest budget. It is a desperate scramble budget to get us through the next year, scrimping around to cover the hole created not by Brexit or COVID, but his pathological addiction to spending other people's money, Mr. Speaker. We now rely on the generosity of benefactors to pay for our parks and our theatres. I make no criticism for their generosity. Their contribution to our community is welcome. But in one way, it is an abdication of responsibility and a reflection of the state of public finances for which they, Mr. Speaker, across this side of the House, are ultimately politically responsible for. Mr. Speaker, this budget demonstrates to all that would care to listen that the government that he leads, Mr. Speaker, has lost the trust and confidence of the people in this community. Our community has lived through a decade of spend, 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 and debt, and debt, debt, and debt. And now appears that we are all about to board tugboat Picardo for a sustained period of collective economic pain, Mr. Speaker. On Tuesday, he romantically talked about himself as being Captain Picardo of HMS Gibraltar, leading us through choppy waters, where the reality is, Mr. Speaker, he is readying himself to abandon the ship, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, moving to other areas of responsibility, Mr. Speaker, the government's now abandoned commitment to green and a child-friendly city. I've heard it being said, Mr. Speaker, by the Chief Minister and the Deputy Chief Minister and others in this House that they will not be able to honour the promises that they made to the people in 2019. It appears, Mr. Speaker, that the green and child-friendly city will be the victim of GSLP mismanagement of our economy. No other government in a refined democracy has abandoned its commitment to the environment. So why should we, Mr. Speaker? Any political party going to the polls in the future, rowing back on its commitment to climate change, for instance, and decarbonisation, will be punished by the electorate, Mr. Speaker. I was surprised to hear from the Minister Cortés on Tuesday that several countries have stepped back on low-carbon measures, which the Minister described in his contribution as short-term and opportunistic. I'd be very interested to hear which countries have stepped back from that commitment because he refused to or simply didn't disclose them. There was nothing in his very short, limited, unfocused, and quite frankly, poor 5-minute contribution on the environment, apart from wishy-washy commitments to climate change that inspired very little hope to those listening that he was truly interested in improving the environment for the betterment of members of our community. The Minister said that the government remained fully committed to Green Gibraltar, but then confirmed in the same breath that he had to pull back on plans and his manifesto commitments. Well, Mr. Speaker, which one is it? We heard a very limited update from the Minister in relation to their decade-long and hitherto undelivered sewage treatment plant, which appears to be no further forward. And in fact, it's not been provided for in the book, save for a limited provision. It appears that Gibraltar will continue to pump raw sewage into the sea with no indication as to how much it will cost the public purse, and despite saying that it could be ready in a year. Again, Mr. Speaker, is it a realistic timetable for the delivery of this project? Insofar as solar power, it is clear that there's been very limited progress and rolling this out more widely. It is also clear from the opposition questions in the House that the move to EV is very slow indeed, that businesses have very little encouragement to move their entire fleets to electric. We will continue, therefore, to see fleets of trucks spewing dirty fumes across our streets, and with increased construction, our health is going to be further impacted by bad air quality. The government must do more, much more, to improve our air quality and cleaning up Gibraltar for all of our residents. We will watch with bated breath how the new instruments that were described by the Minister, that have been purchased by the Minister, will improve public information about air quality. We heard about a sustainable tourism tax, which can be described as a positive step, but the Leader of the Opposition, my own friend Mr. Bolsino, said that it is strategically a bad move. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the prohibited importation of diesel and petrol mopeds as from the 1st of July 2023. Again, it should have happened much earlier. We've been saying this in this House in a number of questions that I put to the Minister. But we are where we are, Mr. Speaker, and we are pleased that they are following policy which we have long promoted in this area. Diesel and petrol mopeds are polluting and noisy, and the sale is counterintuitive. Again, another example of where we lead on constructive and progressive policies, and they follow, Mr. Speaker. I cannot, of course, Mr. Speaker, not deal with Limewall Road and the debacle, Mr. Speaker. The other ministry I am blessed to shadow, of course, Mr. Speaker, is Transport, which was quickly taken back by the Honourable Mr. Balban after a disastrous term himself in health and after Mr. Darignani's massive U-turn on Limewall Road, Mr. Speaker. Who will ever forget the appalling mismanagement by the former Minister for Transport, who famously said in this House that Limewall Road belonged to the government, Mr. Speaker, only to be corrected by the Leader of the Opposition, who put him right on who owns Limewall Road, Mr. Speaker, and that is the people, as the learned Leader of the Opposition has said. Mr. Speaker, they got themselves into a right mess on Limewall Road, Mr. Speaker, and it is the first time I've ever seen the Chief Minister apologise for anything, and he held up his hands. We got it wrong, I think, were the words that he used at the time, Mr. Speaker, and we're grateful for that apology. You know, we all get things wrong, Mr. Speaker, but that was cataclysmic, Mr. Speaker. You know, they jump into ideas, Mr. Speaker, and they don't think about the consequences for normal working families. By way of example, Mr. Speaker, the closure of Limewall Road had a massive negative effect on other important road infrastructure and caused massive untold chaos, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know he doesn't want to listen to this because it's just so painful for him not to listen to his mistake on Limewall Road, but the mistake cost the taxpayer, Mr. Speaker, £300,000. That silly mistake, Mr. Speaker, let that sink in. It's truly embarrassing, Mr. Speaker. The ill-planned, ill-conceived closure of Limewall Road cost the taxpayer £300,000, Mr. Speaker. An example of carelessness and a waste of public money, Mr. Speaker. And now they're increasing prescription costs and cutting sponsored patients, Mr. Speaker. Where is the priority? Mr. Speaker, they have no idea what they're doing anymore. Mr. Speaker, you couldn't make it up. Mr. Speaker, during COVID 2019-2022, they spent nearly £2 million on road surfacing, Mr. Speaker. They estimate to spend £1 million this year on road surfacing, Mr. Speaker. Have you seen, Mr. Speaker, the state of our roads? Where are the improvements, Mr. Speaker? Minister Balban spoke in his contribution of patch jobs to our roads, Mr. Speaker. The public are up in arms in relation to transport and the quality of our roads, and rightly so. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Balban's speech is not going to appease the many who believe that the STTP was a waste of public money, Mr. Speaker. And addressing that point, Mr. Speaker, in 2019-2021, the government spent nearly £8 million on the tunnel roads to North Front. The outturn for 2021 to 2022 is £4.1 million. In 2022 and 2023, they expect to spend £4.5 million on the tunnel, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is £16 million on a tunnel that isn't even open, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the infamous Sustainable Traffic Transport Parking Plan continues to be an uncountable money pit. In 2019-2022, the taxpayer paid £477,000 for the STTP. In years 2021 to 2022, it cost a further $205,000. And for 2022-2023, it is estimated to reach £800,000, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've said it before, Gibraltar requires a radical shake-up in the way we move about our community. But spending millions of pounds on a plan that doesn't work is not the answer, Mr. Speaker. Gibraltar can only change if people in our community have the confidence in the reliability and an availability of public transport. Safe infrastructure for alternatives is essential, and I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Balban, in relation to that, to move our people away from car use and to more sustainable modes of transportation. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister Balban romanticised about his desire for walking and cycling infrastructure, and I applaud and I support his commitment to this, Mr. Speaker, but it isn't backed up, Mr. Speaker, by the members that sit opposite with him. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that his predecessor was certainly not on board with that vision, which I agree is a good one, Mr. Speaker, and we applaud him for that. One which sees our people walking more, Mr. Speaker, cycling more, embracing sustainable and healthier modes of transport. I really do think that the only way that, Mr. Speaker, the Minister will see his vision put into practice is when we shortly move from these benches over to there, Mr. Speaker, where we'll do that very thing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Balban is a lone voice on that side of the House, but we support his vision. In relation to e-scooters, Mr. Speaker, there is no real indication as to when the proposed legislation will be brought before this House. We need an integrated plan that provides public confidence, allows people to explore safer and cleaner modes of transportation. We also need to encourage a full transition to EV, and we require our infrastructure to be significantly upgraded to meet the green and child-friendly commitments set out in their glossy 2019 manifesto. One example is our taxi service, Mr. Speaker, which should be entirely electric in my view, and we should encourage the transition as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker. Gibraltar deserves better than half-baked traffic plan that is costing the public millions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Gibraltar's streets and highways are unsightly, dirty, and whilst millions go out of the Improvement and Development Fund, nothing is improved or developed by the GSLP Liberal Alliance. Whilst they've enjoyed a decade of spending and decadence, Mr. Speaker, they haven't seen the decade of decay on our highways and byways, Mr. Speaker. It is important to remark on the following. So the public know, Mr. Speaker, we spent over £6 million a year for the cleaning of our streets and public spaces. We pay £500,000 a year to monitor air quality, Mr. Speaker. We spend £1.85 million on the Environmental Agency contract. We spend £1.25 million on Alameda Gardens. We spend £100,000 a year on keeping our cemeteries. In most, if not all of those areas, Mr. Speaker, I receive complaints from the public. If it isn't our dirty streets, if it isn't our exceptionally bad air quality affecting the long-term health of our young and old alike, it's the poor state of where our relatives are placed at rest. Where is the supervision? Where's the quality control? Where's the efficiency, assuring that we're getting better value for money? All the public can see from this book is the government spending their money with no real improvements in our environment, and worse still, a deterioration in the way in which our community looks. Mr. Speaker, our air quality is diabolical, and anyone to suggest that we do not have a problem which is directly impacting on the lungs of our children is blind to reality, Mr. Speaker. I am shocked by the reports of doctors on the levels of asthma and other respiratory conditions, as well as the prevalence of allergens. More must be done, and quickly, to stop the increasingly bad and poor quality in our city, air quality in our city. I am not confident, shall I say, that the current minister has the ambition to drive real change in this area. No one in their right mind, Mr. Speaker, believes that this community is well within the 2021 limits imposed by the World Health Organization, and that we have no problem with air quality. The Honourable Gentleman, the Minister for the Environment, paints a rosy picture, but it is far from rosy, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the Honourable Professor's contribution yesterday was completely at odds with that of Mr. Balban's, Mr. Speaker. Don't they speak to each other? Don't they compare notes before they draft their speeches? Should transport, health and environment not be joined up with one message, Mr. Speaker? The fact that the government has changed its air quality work monitors demonstrates that the 20-year-old equipment was not fit for purpose in the first place. And they accept long-standing concerns by NGOs as to our poor air quality. Pausing, Mr. Speaker, there, we should, of course, thank and applaud our health and disability and environmental charities, our NGOs and associations, for the excellent work they do in raising awareness and funds for their causes. We should thank every organiser, Mr. Speaker, every tin shaker for their efforts in ensuring that their health, disability and environmental concerns are raised loud and clear. Mr. Speaker, shortly coming to the end, I wanted to say something about the contribution of the Chief Minister and Mr. Borsino yesterday in relation to another country's approach to the question of abortion. The Chief Minister talked about not having a reverse gear on rights, and Mr. Borsino, I think, talked about the belligerent left. Mr. Speaker, old wounds which were settled in the referendum and the subsequent commencement of the Act should not be reopened. Mr. Speaker, we in this community were torn apart by this question, and let us not continue to create ill feeling. Let our community continue to heal the wounds of these divisions and attempt to live together in peace and harmony with the collective decisions we have made about a seminal issue such as abortion, despite the many views that have been expressed. Before, Mr. Speaker, I close my contribution, a word about yesterday's news in relation to the end of reciprocal healthcare benefits. Mr. Speaker, we have consistently said that the government has mishandled the negotiations by giving away rights to frontier workers with no equivalent rights in return for our people. People will not need to be concerned with taking out health, will now need to be concerned with taking out health insurance for Spain to cover emergency cover there, Mr. Speaker. I think, Mr. Speaker, the end note in relation to that point is that we should have been much more prepared for the situation. And I'm sure that the Chief Minister will deal with that in his reply. But it is a significant move, Mr. Speaker, that was announced yesterday and in which the opposition has replied to in press release today. Mr. Speaker, it is clear to all that after a decade of spending and a decade of decay, to use a Shakespearean theme, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, Mr. Speaker, and there is a real need for a change of direction. We need a government that delivers what it says it will deliver, a government that can be trusted with the public affairs and finances of the community, and a government that puts the health of our community first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.